Okay. All right. So now we're going to try to combine a few of those techniques that you practiced in the first two videos. This is still a practice, okay? So don't get frustrated that it doesn't look exactly the way you want it to. Remember, this is still practice before the final watercolor painting, okay? All right. Today, what you're going to use is more of a little bit larger square piece of paper. Now, this paper that we're using isn't necessarily watercolor paper. So with watercolor, the better paper you use, the better your painting turns out. It's just one of those things. So again, this is practice. When we go to do the actual watercolor, we will, your final watercolor, we'll use watercolor paper, which has a little bit of a tooth to it. This is really smooth, but it's good for practice. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to do is we're going to do what's called a wet on wet. And you want to grab one of these big brushes. This is not a watercolor brush. There's a few back there. So if you find one of the softer, big flat brushes, they work better. I just grabbed this one. This one happens to be more of an acrylic or an oil brush because the bristles are much stiffer. But it'll work for what I'm doing right now. Okay, so the first technique is when you're trying to lay down, you want to cover a large area with paint. And we call it a wash. And the technique is called wet on wet. So you should tape this down. I didn't tape mine down because I'm going to switch this in a second, but you should tape it down. And then just hang on to the board. That's the board you can just use for this whole watercolor thing, watercolor unit. And you can put the board either in the drying rack or you can slide them, just talk to me, and you can slide them vertically back where you got it and store it that way too. It's actually probably easier to do it that way. All right, so this is for a wash. It's called a flat wash. And we're going to start with a wet on wet technique, okay? So that means what you do first is lightly wet the paper. Now because this is not watercolor paper, you can see already how my paper is warping. That's why it's important to tape down, okay? So I'm just, all right. So now my paper is wet, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a color, and I'm going to lay in a flat wash, okay? So I'm using my paintbrush pretty wet, and I'm loading up, and I'm just flat washing an entire space. So this is good, if you were doing a landscape and you wanted to do the sky or the water, or if we're going to be doing close-ups of objects and there's going to be some large spaces, this is good for that. When you're doing this, you can also create kind of a graduated, go from dark to light like you did yesterday. You can blend a couple colors. If you were to let this dry a second and then load up some more of this orange, you could get a deeper color. So there's some variety of things you can do with that, okay? All right, but for today, we're just kind of practicing the wet on wet wash. All right, I'm going to move this because this is wet. Okay, here's the paper I already prepared. So can you see how it's already curling? So that's why you need to tape, because then it makes your life a little bit miserable when it curls like that. But for today, I just wanted to show you something quickly. Okay, so what we're going to do today is paint some violets. And the reason I chose violets is because that way I can teach you a couple of different techniques. So this paper is now dry, okay? So I did the flat wash, and now I've let it dry. So now what I'm going to do, this technique is called wet on dry. So the paper's dry, but I'm going to load up my paintbrush decently wet. And when I say this paper's dry, like it's sort of dry. I really just did it 10 minutes ago. So ideally it would be really dry. You can use the heat gun if you want. Okay. So I'm going to load up, and okay. Make sure you're using a lot of water, because this is a wet or dry on wet on dry. Sorry, you're using a wet paintbrush on dry surface. So you don't want it, if you're dry on dry, it'll be really dark, and I'll show you that in a second. Okay. Just like, we're not going for realism today, guys. I'm just trying to show you practice. Okay. So I'm going to do a couple of those, just so you have a couple opportunities to try this. Okay. The purple's a little intense, so that's why I'm trying to be careful not to make sure it's pretty watery. All right. So now I'm going to give those a second to dry here. Okay. And you know how when you watch a cooking show and they're like, through the magic of TV, we have something baked. Through the magic of pausing, I just dried my violets. Okay. So I'm going to come back. So I did a purple wash. Now, this is a technique that's called glazing. And really what it means is I took one color and I'm going to glaze another color over it. So that means I'm going to use another color, very thin, very watery. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back in here on my violet, on my purple, and I'm going to glaze over it with some blue. I don't want to mix the two colors. That's why the purple had to be dry before I put the blue on top. So it's another wet on dry technique, okay? So it's allowing me to get a variation in color, but not mix the two colors. Okay. Remember to keep it thin because this is glazing. So you're not trying to cover the purple. You're just trying to add another dimension. Okay, awesome. All right, now while I let those dry, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add some leaves. Okay. So remember, this is not supposed to look super realistic. We're just practicing techniques. So if you're like, Miss Hawkins, that doesn't look like a violet. Yeah, I know. Okay, so I'm going to add some leaves. So at first, I'm going to do kind of a wash. I'm not going in super intense with the green. So this is another wet on dry. Okay. Add some more here. And this is good practice to make sure that when you're painting kind of loaded up with water near something that's very wet, so like my blue is very wet still, how to be careful so that you don't end up with the watercolors bleeding. Kind of like yesterday when you were practicing with the abstract colors kind of everywhere and letting it bleed. So now you're like, ooh, how do I control this so it doesn't bleed? Okay, awesome. I'm gonna add one more right here. Okay, so now we have practiced wet on wet, wet on dry, some glazing, and the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna work on some dry on dry. So hold on. Okay, so I just dried this off again. So now what I wanna show you is a dry on dry. So with watercolor, especially when you're using the pans, when I say dry on dry, you still have to put a little bit of water on your brush. Otherwise, you just can't pick up the paint, okay? We'll use some tube watercolor as well for the next project, which is a little easier to do dries on dries. Okay, so here we go. So I'm going to take my paintbrush, fairly dry. I dried my paper off. And what I'm going to do now is I'd like to add in some finer detail. Oh, you know what? Actually, I'm going to go with yellow first. I want to add some finer details of the violets. So I'm going to come in with some, see, this is what I mean. You got to get the paint a little bit with these pans. All right. So I want to add some yellow to the center. And theoretically, I probably should have left a little bit of white, but whatever. Okay. So I'm adding a little yellow. Now, typically violets have a little bit of, and because I'm making this up out of my head, but because we're practicing, a little bit of some yellow streaks from the center. So I'm gonna do that. And I'm working dry on dry. And the reason being is that will make your paint much more opaque. And using a dry on dry method is much more like drawing, actually. Some people fully use their watercolors this way. It's called gouache because they like the real thick, opaque. The beauty for most people of the beauty of most people of watercolor is the transparency. But hang on, Miss P's walking in. I'm gonna pause it. Okay, so you can see there I added some yellow. Now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna rinse my brush off and I'm gonna go in with some purple. And see how I can now like go in and add some deeper value because I'm using the dry on dry. Now, if you do this and you're like, ooh, that was a little more dry on dry than I wanted, no big deal. Just wet your brush and blend it in, okay? And see how I just kind of blended that in. So you can still blend that. Okay, so I want you to practice with that. I want you to try it with the leaves too. I'm going with a little brown. All right, so you're practicing wet on wet for washes. You're practicing wet on dry, and then dry on dry, okay? When you're done, take a picture, post it in classroom for this assignment so I can check it out.